Being in majority a product of the 90s and early 2000s obsession with massive militarized bipedal weaponry, a good deal of mech-based games found their existences relegated to a number of promising yet ultimately doomed consoles. I will be getting to a great deal of these, such as the Samurai Mech games for Mac and Starfire, but I don't think I'll ever come across a series so entirely doomed as Iron Soldier.
We must stop the evil war machine that's crushing our cities, destroying our defenses, blowing up innocent trees.
Released in 1994 on the Atari Jaguar and ending on the utterly obscure Nuon series of DVD players, these games were lucky to even make it as far as they did. If not perhaps for the strange and chaotic climate of gaming back in the 90s, I highly doubt there would have been a second game, let alone a third, and especially if something like this were to be released by a major publisher nowadays. Now, I didn't decide to tackle the Iron Soldier games for the sole reason of it being a mech simulator. Lord knows there are other series I could go after out there, and probably need to. But I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to explore something on the Atari Jaguar itself. This system had a decently long lifespan, yet utterly failed for a slew of reasons.
Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
Ultimately, soon after releasing the Jaguar CD peripheral, the system would be put to rest with only 150,000 units sold over 3 years, even despite being a whole $100 cheaper than its competitors. Hearing that a series of mech simulation games had somehow existed on the platform immediately had me hooked. I had to check out Iron Soldier immediately, and oh boy, this is going to be a weird one. Hearing of the Jaguar from a certain angry person on the internet, I'd went into Iron Soldier expecting the worst possible outcome. Even if I hadn't have seen James Rolfe's scathing derailment of Atari's final entry into the console market, I probably would have been leery just looking at the controller itself. This thing looks intimidating, and I knew from experience that when a wild, crazy, bulky numpad is involved, some developer's going to develop a control scheme that uses the entire thing.
Only on the 64-bit Jaguar.
I'm almost certain a game like that probably does exist, but Iron Soldier isn't it. Instead, the numpad is basically used for switching weapons or viewing level stats. It does take a little memorization to know which button ties to what weapon, but it isn't exactly what I'd call daunting. The story of Iron Soldier is as basic as it gets, with the Iron Fist Corporation doing what evil corporations do best: oppress the civilian populace. You're part of the rebellion who has secured one of the IS units and now wishes to use it to topple this militaristic entity. Ironically, you're doing this with a military weapon, and most of the time you'll be blowing the hell out of buildings that I'm fairly sure are filled with those citizens you are looking to free. But hey, who cares? This is a game, right? Nobody wants to be punished for punching a building down. Controlling the IS is a little difficult at first, with the D-pad used for both aiming and movement. You'll need to hold down the forward button and accelerate, then aim and fire as you continue on whatever trajectory you set forth. It can be a little frustrating when sometimes your mech doesn't want to move in the direction you want it to, but when things work, they work well enough. The control scheme really isn't that obtuse. There are a slew of weapons defined and used throughout the game's 16 missions, which will all task you with dismantling some aspect of corporate control. All of them are extremely straightforward, the only frustration coming from enemies and buildings that tend to take a little too much damage. So you can expect a rifle or Gatling gun to shoot just exactly as you think they should, and for punching to do exactly that. But do note that this game has one of the weirdest ways of handling grenades. It isn't that using them is bad at all. In fact, grenades are probably some of the most useful high damage weapons in this game, but when they are thrown, instead of being tossed, they drop a set distance from your mech. In an age where grenades can be frustratingly bouncy or horribly realistic in just about any game you play, this proves to be oddly good. Being able to actually control where an explosive falls can really help with those objectives involving the destruction of something like a warehouse, complex, or bridge. So immediately you're going to notice that this game is bare bones graphically. There isn't a texture on just about anything aside from those basic health and ammo pickups. That's okay though, this might have been a complaint way back during the game's release, but it does have a certain charm to it. It suits the style that the developers were going for at the time, with most of the game art being in a style that's close to those used in a lot of mid-90s indie comics. Now, being the first game I played on the system, I don't have anything to compare it to either, but I liked it, I really did. And likely, it allowed the developers to include things such as building and environmental destruction without taxing the Jaguar too much. I won't say that it's all good though. Draw distances in this game are absolutely terrible, and unless you're practically on top of an enemy, they'll often resemble a pixelated blur even at closer ranges.
What is that?
Not knowing what to expect, I really didn't think I'd find a halfway decent soundtrack here. Iron Soldier's got some decent tunes going on, all of which kept me engaged throughout. I'm not really sure if there's anything special about the Jaguar's sound card, but the sound here was really unique, and if there isn't already a scene for Jaguar tracks out there, I really think there should be. I mean, just listen for yourself and you'll see what I mean. Would I have been disappointed to receive the Jaguar in this game as a kid? No, not at all. As I said, there are 16 levels here, each fully open for you to play around in and tackle objectives in any way you really see fit. I found myself replaying a lot of these stages, not even minding a few deaths here and there, because I knew there was always a possibility I could try something else or go about things from another angle. Yes, graphically it is basic, but this is a 1994 home console release, so we can't be too picky, can we? I wouldn't be too afraid of the Jaguar. This game shows that it's not all as bad as it's been made out to be. Iron Soldier is a very good game with tons of variety and lots of gameplay and content to be had. It doesn't hold up to modern standards, of course, but I really can't suggest it enough if you're looking for a retro mech simulator experience. Released at the end of the Atari Jaguar's lifespan as both a cartridge and for the CD peripheral, Iron Soldier 2 found itself released on a console that was dead.
It's dead. It's finally dead.
Eclipse Software did develop the sequel as well, but it was instead published by Telegames, who had enjoyed a small, short-lived monopoly on the system after its abandonment by Atari.
Atari Jaguar 64-bit, $149.
1997 would still see a series of mech titles gaining prominence in gaming media, and so Iron Soldier 2 would be unfairly compared to titles such as Mech Warrior, Armored Core, and Gun Griffin. While it didn't exactly have the depth of any of those titles, I wouldn't exactly say it needed it either. Mech Warrior and Armored Core fans would have a load of releases to play with, and while Gun Griffin was extremely good, its tones and execution were entirely different. With the first Iron Soldier, writer Sean Patton had drawn a great deal of inspiration from other mecha series, as well as kaiju films such as Godzilla.
Godzilla, king of the monsters, alive, surging up from the depths of the sea on a tidal wave of terror.
So despite the story being about the dismantling of an evil corporation, its colorful environments and chunky comic style made Iron Soldier somewhat of an outsider among outsiders. Likely no one played Iron Soldier because they liked those games, and no one played those games because they liked Iron Soldier. So what I'm basically trying to get at here is that I don't find that comparison to be a good one or exactly fair. The second game is very close to the original with just a few improvements. In fact, I have a hard time really saying that Iron Soldier 2 is any true sequel. Instead, I'd probably say it's more of a 1.5 version of the original. There is no blurb about the story with this one. As far as I can tell, you're simply continuing the same mission as the original, to destroy an evil corporation with the most cumbersome weapon ever created. Through the mission briefings, I do know that this evil corporation is no longer Iron Fist, but instead Penta. So again, this does still feel like a 1.5 or maybe even a reboot.
But I intend to find out. Reboot!
Nothing about the gameplay has been changed at all, no additional weapons or changes to how they handle. You'll still be dropping grenades from the sky to blow up the same buildings, or gunning down copters with your rifle or Gatling gun. There are a few extra enemies, being a few extra mech and vehicle types, and you'll be able to tackle 20 new missions, but they all are very eerily similar. While the first game wasn't exactly a slump with difficulty, this one ramps it up, despite enemies taking the same amount of damage for the most part. I think the trouble mostly comes from how spread out objectives can be now. Areas were fairly large in the original, but here they're just a tad bigger, with enemy spawns sometimes being directly at your feet. As well, some stages have you chasing down wayward walkers that run all over the map and force you to slowly pick off their health as basic enemies whittle yours down. I'll be getting more into this later, but your IS just simply does not have the speed for it. You'll also be outclassed by enemies that aren't hindered by the game's woeful draw distance, something that hasn't been improved here.
What the hell is that?
The main takeaway here is the addition of textures, with the graphics being improved almost all over. You won't be seeing a whole lot of this unless it's close, but the comic style has been exemplified a little with some additional texture work on buildings, enemies, and even the Iron Soldier itself. Is it enough to push this game into sequel territory? Not really. A lot of this game still has barren shapes, especially the ground and roads. At times, the texture work was so minimal that I couldn't even tell a building had been improved until I realized it maybe had a few extra rivets or lines for definition. As I said earlier, I can't really say how much this game feels more like an overstuffed mission pack with some extra stuff added rather than a full game. It's more like a 1.5 or even a reboot. It's sort of like releasing Half-Life with the HD texture pack and calling it Half-Life 2. Not only are the improvements and additions minimal, but the missions themselves are really close to what the original offered. Going through the vast majority of them, I found them all to be somewhat remixes of what the original had. The very first mission even has you taking down warehouses like in the original, only now you have to chase down walkers that escape after doing so, and man, I cannot express how unfun this mission actually is. As I said earlier, the IS does not move fast enough to chase anything, so parts like this are a nightmare. There were a few mission types in the original that were somewhat frustrating, mostly those dealing with timed objectives, but apparently the developers didn't get the memo or learn much about player demand over the years, as Iron Soldier 2 is just completely full of them. Not only that, but you're going to be immediately faced with escort and protection missions that have you underpowered against highly armed mechanized foes, especially walkers, which, I repeat, are too fast and probably the worst enemies in this game. You can't even punch them without taking damage, which just makes them even more of a nuisance.
What happened?
With the Jaguar CD version, the only true benefit is the presence of a soundtrack. While the cart version does have the menu music, there isn't anything playing during levels. Getting a copy of that CD version is extremely difficult. Non-legitimate ways can net you a ROM, but playing it in 2023 is still not that easy, not yet. So everything you're seeing here is the cart version, which is also likely the most common version Jaguar players had back in the day, and boy, this game really needs its music. Luckily, though I can't get the CD version to run myself, I managed to get Windows Media Player to play the missing music, so I present to you a sample of Iron Soldier 2's pretty incredible soundtrack. Anyone who bought this game was a fan of the first, and what they were getting was probably exactly what they wanted, more of the first. It isn't great though. Mission difficulty really undercuts the fun here, with every imaginable mission having you doing some frustrating task that has you fumbling around and dying constantly. In fact, you die so much in Iron Soldier 2 that they even removed the life system here. Is it a great second entry? No, but the gameplay remains, and if a player happened to take the time to master what the first had to offer, they likely really enjoyed what was here.
Why would I buy a 32-bit system for $300 when I can get a 64-bit Jaguar system for $149?
The Atari Jaguar would disappear not long after this release, being crushed by even the Saturn's sales. It would be a quiet, sad death for the console, but not Iron Soldier, not yet. Anybody that played this series likely played Iron Soldier 3 first. This game was released on the PlayStation originally, which gave it a far wider audience and the developers a few more tools to work with. I'll be playing the PlayStation version here, but it's worth mentioning that this game had a remaster of sorts on one of the most obscure consoles of all time, the Nuon. This system was basically a DVD player with gaming functionality. The graphics were apparently akin to the PlayStation 2, but it only had 8 games, one of them sadly being Iron Soldier 3. Now this game isn't entirely unattainable. Songbird Productions has released this version yet again, though it's in its original format, and while I certainly do have a DVD player, I don't have a Nuon. Nor do I really want to pay $200 for one or almost $300 for the controller.
Not for that price.
Iron Soldier 3 begins with one of the longest introduction FMVs I've ever seen on the PlayStation. Seriously, this thing is around 5 minutes long and consists of nothing more than the Iron Soldier walking around clumsily destroying things. Strangely, this FMV also switches between several animation styles, clearly showing several moments of cel-shaded graphics that never return. Nothing about the story really changes, with everything still being the same interchangeable struggle against the Penta Corporation, only this time you're part of the United States Republic. I don't really understand how a corporation could have the power to fight a whole country, but okay. I'm not exactly sure if this is the same IS unit from the second game, but if it is, Penta really needs to do something about security because rebels are just grabbing these things whenever something goes to hell. Or I guess in this case, entire countries.
This is it. Catch me if you can.
There are improvements across the board with Iron Soldier 3, the most notable being the graphics. The comic style has been completely removed, likely due to the PlayStation being far more capable than the Atari Jaguar. It does severely alter the tone, with everything being a whole lot darker and far more serious than the comic-like style of the original, but I do understand this since the game's primary competitors were those it was being compared against with Iron Soldier 2. The change here is honestly surprisingly welcome. Things look really good, and just about everything aside from the HUD retains its original design. Not only that, but aside from a few balancing changes and walker speeds, thank God, and the amount of damage some enemies absorb, everything acts the same too. So this probably had the few Atari Jaguar owners with Iron Soldier a bit happy and more welcome to transitioning to the PlayStation. Again, much like Iron Soldier 2, due to the bare-bones story and recycle mission types, this feels more like a reboot than a genuine sequel. Whatever you think Iron Soldier 3 might actually be, I really don't think they should have called this Iron Soldier 3. Bringing an obscure franchise from the Atari Jaguar over to PlayStation and then titling it 3 is just plain confusing, especially when a lot of people didn't experience the Jaguar. Remember, it only sold 150,000 units, and that's abysmal.
Yeah, we gave it our best, but I guess our best wasn't good enough, eh?
I'd love to report a list of changes in gameplay, but the only genuine improvement is the fact that you move a whole lot faster. Being a simulation, the controls are still geared towards being more vehicle-like. Unlike the Jaguar controller, where you accelerate with a button and use the D-pad to choose your direction, you can now use either right shoulder pad to move forward or backwards. If you have a DualShock, you can use the right thumbstick to do the same as well, and I have to say, this really makes the game far more playable than other entries. Not that they weren't, it's just more accessible now. I had a whole lot more luck avoiding enemy fire and getting from one side of an area to another. This can be a lifesaver, and it does make frustrating escort missions a whole lot easier. Iron Soldier 3 also brings multiplayer to the table, not versus, but instead a weird co-op mode. You can play missions through with a partner on the same system, and it's honestly pretty terrible. One person controls movement while the other fires. This allows for one player to have significantly more fun than the other, and ultimately, I don't suggest it at all. If you get bored of playing as the not-so-iconic Iron Soldier, there are a few other mechs you can play around with, but they all pretty much handle the same. In fact, they're all somewhat useless, especially considering you can't punch with them. Now, punching is very useful since you need it to break down buildings, otherwise it takes a load of ammo to do so. So this basically makes some objectives more tedious. But hey, if you want to roleplay as a walker, go right ahead. It's worth mentioning as well that the soundtrack here is very much late 90s to 2000s. You're getting a lot of pulse-pounding, dancey music. It's something you'd hear in a badly written, edgy action movie of the early 2000s. So, pretty generic for the time. Of all three Iron Soldier games, the third one is definitely the best. It does have some problems, removes the comic style, but it's not really that missed. The graphics and the slight gameplay differences, especially with the DualShock, really do make all the difference with this one. Sadly, while none of us are going to be playing the Nuon version anytime soon, this is still a worthwhile game and one you should probably go after. It's definitely a hidden gem. Iron Soldier was a series born of passion and cursed with extremely bad luck. Being born on the Jaguar, it barely had a chance to begin with, but it did manage to make it to the PlayStation. Sadly, aside from Songbird Productions releasing the Nuon game once again, there has been no mention of Iron Soldier in a long time. It's hard to tell if there will ever be a re-release of any of these games, or even an Iron Soldier 4, but who knows? If it does happen, you'll be sure to see it on my channel. This has been Kei-Nova. Thank you for watching. If you can like and subscribe, it helps the channel grow, and if you like my videos, please make any suggestions for future series so I can make better videos. Thanks again.